Title: Flight attendant disrespected Ibrahim Traoré and was speechless after this revelation. There are mornings that seem ordinary, but hide within them a story that will change the way people look at an entire person and sometimes an entire nation. The pale sunlight shines on the large glass windows of Charles de Gaulle Airport, Paris. Streams of people move silently, each one carried away by their own thoughts, their own trips. No one pays attention to the man in a simple khaki jacket, carrying a worn-out backpack, leisurely walking slowly through the security check gates. He looks like any ordinary African passenger, calm, patient, a little shy, to avoid the scrutiny that is inherent in this place. But there is something in his eyes, in his steady yet gentle steps, that makes those who really pay attention feel this is not an ordinary person. That man was Ibrahim Traoré, the President of Burkina Faso. But no one here knew that, and he didn't want anyone to know. Traoré was used to keeping himself simple and approachable, without a noisy entourage, without ostentatious banners. He believed that true power lay not in crowns or ceremonies, but in the heart and the indomitable will. He walked up to the check-in counter. A group of airport staff in light blue uniforms were processing passengers with their usual mechanical attitude. Some were tired, some were irritable. And then Traoré's eyes met those of a stewardess standing there, the one who would soon become the main character in this story. She was young, fair-skinned, with blonde hair tied up high, her movements quick, but her eyes held the cold arrogance common to people accustomed to judging others by their appearance. Traoré placed his passport on the counter, waiting. The stewardess glanced at him, brief glance, enough to fit him into a familiar pattern in her mind. A black man, plainly dressed, from a small African country. She didn't even look at the passport. The way she exhaled impatiently through her nose said it all. "Go to the back," she said, her voice curt, more commanding than instructing. Traoré tilted his head slightly, politely asking in French, "Excuse me, could you tell me if the flight is delayed?" The stewardess pursed her lips, not even bothering to hide her disdain. No need to ask, just follow the instructions. Around her, a few other passengers glanced back, some snickering, some shaking their heads. Some looked pitying, others just indifferent. Here, at this international airport, such moments were not uncommon. Another African treated coldly, a routine. But they didn't know the man was no ordinary African. A light breeze blew through the waiting room, carrying with it the chill of the Parisian morning. Traoré was silent, not angry, not protesting. He just smiled very slightly. The calm smile of someone who was used to the superficial judgment of the world. He took his passport, followed the instructions, and entered the waiting area. A few security guards glanced at him, but then looked away. No one recognized the name on the passport, the name that had shaken the entire African continent, Ibrahim Traoré. Meanwhile, the flight attendant returned to her work, her face not realizing that she had just insulted one of the bravest young leaders in the world today. In the dim yellow light of the waiting area, Traoré sat quietly, taking a small book from his old backpack. It was a torn copy of Frantz Fanon's classic, The Wretched of the Earth. He flipped through the pages as if seeking spiritual strength from the words that had nourished the fighting spirit of a generation of Africans. Time passed slowly. The loudspeakers blared out cold announcements, called the names of flights, reminded passengers to check their papers. But somewhere in the air, something was changing. A slow, invisible change, like the ripples on the surface of water before a storm. And then, the moment came. A senior airport employee, an elderly Frenchman in a sharp suit, walked briskly toward the counter where the stewardess stood. He held a thick file, his face tense. The stewardess saw him and frowned slightly. "What's the matter?" The man did not answer immediately. He whispered in her ear, and instantly her face blanched. She turned, her eyes darting around the waiting area in panic. Because finally, she knew. The person she had just despised was none other than President Ibrahim Traoré, a man who had stood up to world powers, a man who had sworn to protect the freedom and dignity of millions of his countrymen. And in that moment, everything began to collapse inside her. The flight attendant stood frozen in the middle of the bright lobby. The surrounding sounds seemed to disappear, leaving only her heart pounding in her ears. During her time working at the airport, she had received many famous people, politicians, actors, wealthy businessmen, but never had she made such a terrible mistake. The president of a country, a head of state, treated like an inferior just because of his plain appearance. The shock that twisted her heart was stronger than any shame she had ever experienced. Not daring to hesitate, she hurriedly walked towards the waiting area, where the man in the khaki jacket was still quietly reading a book, seemingly unconcerned with the chaos his true identity was causing behind him. A few other employees, upon hearing the news, also hurriedly followed her. The air in the waiting area thickened. The people sitting around were beginning to notice that something was different. Curious glances, whispers, "What's going on? Who is it? A president?" The flight attendant approached. Her legs were shaking, her hands clutching a small handkerchief to hide her confusion. She stood before Traoré, bowed her head, her voice choked. "Sir, I apologize for my lack of respect earlier." Traoré looked up from his book. A moment seemed endless. He looked at her not with anger, not with the contempt she feared, but with a calm, quiet gaze, as if he had long been accustomed to these invisible wounds. "It's okay," Traoré said in a deep, gentle, yet weighty voice. "I don't carry a throne. I carry the hopes of my people." That sentence, simple as it was like a knife gently cutting into the young girl's self-esteem. A few other employees, now realizing the situation, stepped forward and apologized profusely. A senior manager bowed, inviting Traoré to move to the business class waiting area, offering to take him to a private VIP room, with all the privileges reserved for heads of state. But Traoré just smiled and shook his head. "I don't need a private room. I like to sit with everyone. Just like my country, small but resilient, always wanting to stand with the world and not hide behind walls." That refusal, seemingly simple, was like a wake-up call to everyone present. They looked at him no longer as a man dressed simply, but as an inner strength, a proud dignity that no title could bestow. The stewardess, now close to tears, managed to speak. "Would you allow me to make amends by serving you for the rest of the flight?" An awkward, immature request, but one that came from heart. Traoré smiled again, the kind of indulgent smile that only those who have experienced injustice can give. "Let's forget what just happened," he said, his voice like a cool breeze in the cold winter. "But remember, always look beyond appearances. Always treat everyone with respect, whether they carry old backpacks or shiny crowns." The words were meant not just for her, but for everyone watching. No one dared to breathe. No one dared to look away. An eerie silence fell over the waiting room, not out of fear, but out of respect. A respect that cannot be forced, cannot be bought with money. It can only grow naturally from true dignity and character. In that moment, it was as if time had stopped. The flight was announced to be boarding. The flight attendant bowed again, then quickly returned to her duties, this time with trembling hands but a heart that had changed forever. Traoré stood up. He slung his backpack over his shoulder, his gesture as simple as when he arrived. But now, with every step he took, the people around him unconsciously made way, as if they were a king not for the throne, but for his character. He walked to the boarding gate, without applause, without an entourage, but everyone's eyes followed him silently, admiringly, and perhaps also thoughtfully. Because today, in this strange place, a lesson was being taught, a lesson in respect, in how one man can make the world bow with only his humility and dignity. And the story is not over yet. As Traoré stepped onto the plane stairs, The air around him was thick with silent glances. The crew stood in a line at the door of the plane, following the ritual of welcoming special passengers. But this time, the ritual was more than just a formality. It carried a sense of confusion, a respect that permeated every gesture. The stewardess who had been standing at the head of the line earlier tried to maintain her composure, but her hands clenched tightly around the hem of her uniform skirt betrayed an undisguised tension. The flight attendant, a middle-aged, elegant man, stepped forward and bowed to Traoré more deeply than usual. "Sir," he said in French, his voice low and respectful, "we apologize for the inconvenience. Please come to first class." Traoré merely nodded, showing neither anger nor arrogance. He understood, and had long since accepted, that the path to success for people like him would always be filled with judgmental eyes, with contemptuous words. But he also understood that true victory lay not in responding with indignation, but in standing firm in the storm of prejudice. He stepped into the first-class cabin. A comfortable, spacious seat had been prepared for him. A glass of cold fruit juice was placed there. As a silent apology, the other passengers in the cabin, mostly Western businessmen, looked at him with quiet curiosity. They might not have recognized his identity, but they felt an invisible weight radiating from this man. The plane began to roll. A soft, gentle sound pushed the heavy steel body forward, like a symbol of the heavy dreams that Africa still cherishes. During the takeoff, Traoré sat silently, his eyes looking far away out the window, where the gray clouds gradually rolled towards the horizon. His thoughts kept flowing about his homeland, Burkina Faso, that was fighting every day against injustice, about his brothers, the farmers, the workers, the students who placed their hopes in his leadership, and about the African children who had never learned that a person's worth was never determined by the color of their skin or the coat they wore. The young flight attendant who had made the mistake this morning, after a moment of hesitation, gathered up her courage and approached. "Sir," she whispered, placing a tray of snacks on his table, "I would like to serve you throughout the flight, as a way to show my respect." Traoré looked at her. It was a look that did not judge, that did not punish. He saw in her the image of millions of other people, people who were not necessarily evil, simply bound by unconscious prejudices that the world had passed down for generations. "You do not need to atone," he said, his voice warm and firm. "What is more important is that you understand the lesson today and carry it with you for the rest of your life." The girl nodded, her eyes red. In that moment, there was no longer a boundary between the head of state and the flight attendant. There were only two people, one giving mercy, the other receiving it with all his heart. The flight continued to pass in solemn silence. After a while, the flight leader appeared, along with the flight captain, an older, experienced Frenchman. They politely asked permission to say a few words to the rest of the passengers. "Ladies and gentlemen," the captain said over the loudspeaker, "today we have the honor of welcoming a special guest on board, President Ibrahim Traoré of Burkina Faso." A low murmur spread through the cabin. A few passengers looked up, stunned. Others applauded lightly, not the loud applause usually associated with big events, but a solemn, respectful sound. Traoré inclined his head slightly, returning the greeting. No ostentatious gesture, no flowery speech. Just by his quiet, powerful presence, he had made the entire crowd bow to his true worth. The young flight attendant stood in the corner of the cabin, quietly observing. Inside her, an undercurrent was churning. She had learned the most valuable lesson of her life, that true power does not require shouting, does not require wearing a brilliant cape. It radiates from kindness, tolerance, and unshakable resilience. The flight continued on, carrying a story that will forever be engraved in the hearts of those who witnessed it. And then, as the plane broke through the gray clouds, revealing the brilliant blue sky above, a new light was lit in everyone's hearts. A light of belief that somewhere in this world there are still leaders like Ibrahim Traoré. When the plane's wheels touched down on the runway of Ouagadougou Airport, it was already late afternoon. An orange-yellow sky spread out like a warm silk, dyeing the entire space. The last rays of the day reflected on the plane's body, making it shine like a warhorse that had just completed its fateful journey. Passengers began to stand up, preparing to leave their seats. But this time, unlike when it took off, all eyes were on the man sitting silently in the first row of the first-class cabin. A silent, deep respect spread like a silent electric current through each person. Traoré stood up, shouldering his backpack. The same simple gesture, the same calm. But now, each step he took off the plane carried the weight of a message of dignity, of self-respect, of an indomitable spirit. As he approached the plane door, the young flight attendant hurried over. Her eyes hesitated, as if she wanted to say something, but Traoré understood. He simply nodded, a nod that conveyed forgiveness, understanding, and hope. Outside, a small group of Burkinabe people were waiting. Not a lavish king, not a powerful politician, but a son of the country, a man who had carried the dreams of an entire nation on his shoulders. A diplomat approached, whispering, "Sir, there is a small group of press and people waiting. They are eager to hear you say a few words." Traoré nodded slightly. He stepped out onto the airport steps, a hot wind, carrying the scent of the red soil of the great forest wrapped around him. Sunday-tanned African faces, sparkling eyes looked up at him with undisguised pride. There was no fancy podium, no microphone with the logo of international television. There was only a small, old speaker and a simple microphone. Traoré took the microphone. He stood up straight, the sunset painting his face golden, making him look like a living statue of hope and determination. He took a deep breath. Then, his deep voice echoing in the silence, he began. Asterisk, I have had a long journey. A journey not only through distant lands, but also through the prejudices, the contemptuous looks, the challenges that the world still has for us, those who come from this continent. I have met contemptuous eyes. I have heard cold words. I have felt the cold of disrespect. Just because I did not wear an expensive suit, did not bring a noisy entourage. But you know what? I do not need them to recognize me with their eyes. I do not need them to value me with their clothes or titles. Because my value, like the value of each of us Africans, is not in our appearance. It is in our heart. It is in our resilience. It is in our unyielding spirit, no matter how many times the world turns its back on us. I did not come here to ask for pity. I come here to declare Africa does not need permission to hold its head high. We do not need anyone to tell us how to be human. We have great ancestors. We have a proud history. And we have a future that we will build ourselves, without asking anyone, without bowing to anyone. Today, I stand here in my homeland, not as a president, but as a son of this continent, to say to you, we will go on. We will learn. We will fight. And one day soon, the world will bow before the dignity of Africa. Not because we are richer, not because we are stronger, but because we have never lost our dignity. Asterisk! Asterisk! He paused. A moment of silence, not because no one heard, but because every word he had just spoken was deeply ingrained in the flesh and blood of the people standing before him. Then, as if bursting from deep within his heart, a burst of applause rang out, an uncontrollable applause, reverberating into the crimson sky, spreading throughout the airport, like an endless epic. The people surrounded Traoré, hugs, cheers, tears glistening in the sunset. And in that moment, not just Burkina Faso, but all of Africa, seemed to stand up dignified, confident, glowing with unquenchable pride. Today's story will not stop at a flight, an apology, a speech. It will be told, from mouth to mouth, different, from generation to generation. As a reminder, when you hold on to your dignity, no force can make you bow down. And the name of Ibrahim Traoré, the simple but great leader, will forever be in the hearts of those who believe that it is resilience and humility that light the way to freedom.